the artistry on display here is magnificent. Like someone knows anatomy and is holding realistic proportions. Someone understands light and shadow. This is a masterpiece by, someone we don't know anymore, but it's very old. And this may just be Blue Man. Why does the past entrance us the way that it does? It's a question I've turned over in my head all summer as I worked on this presentation for the symposium. And one thing I noticed is the past doesn't equally entrance us in all cases. On the left here is something I was told in my childhood in Texas should very much entrance me. I find an arrowhead on the ground and I pick it up, and I should be entranced, drawn into the story of the past, a human who did something there. But it never really did much for me. I put them back down. I found them. But on the right is something that really entrances me. It's a photograph that reminds me of a time about 10 years ago when I went back to the land where my grandparents on my mom's side once lived. And it was a late afternoon, almost mythical, the way Gard would have mentioned yesterday. And as I walked on the land, sun-dappled moats in the air, grasshoppers leaping, I came upon in this wild forested area a wild zucchini plant growing. What's a wild zucchini plant doing in the middle of a forest? That's a cultivated species. I walked a little further and I came upon a white plastic drain pipe sticking out of the ground, with nothing else around it. What's that doing there? These entranced me, and I've wondered why. Is it just because of mystery? I don't think that's just it. I think it's a particular kind of mystery. On the left here is something that feels very much appropriate and of its time. It is a more primitive tool. It's not a machete, it's not a gun, it is a hand-chiseled arrowhead. And I think there's something deep within us, call it a cosmic intuition, that says that feels correct for something in the past to be less developed. But on the right here, when you come upon a cultivated agricultural species or a PVC pipe coming out of the ground, there are these tantalizing hints that something was here before that was more advanced than is here now. And indeed, that is the case. I don't even think it's about the facts of the case. On the right here, I can attest, I was there. My grandparents' house was once there. I spent months of my life in my childhood in that house. I know it was there, and I know there was a family garden there. There's something deep in us that just is entranced by a connection to the past in this way where it feels like something more advanced happened and we lost touch with it. And the fifth epical revelation, the Urantia book, it gives new forms of those stories, almost those mythologies, to us in spades. So I wanted to examine that as I thought about initially the impetus for this presentation, the archaeological site Göbekli Tepe. But I quickly found as I began to do my research, I needed to frame this bigger. We deserve, as students of this book, to understand the context we're operating in. And I'm so grateful yesterday, if you were here, you heard Gard Jamieson talk about these different epochs of understanding we've been through. In the last few hundred years, we have been in what you would call the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment era. Running from left to right here, you can see that in the 1700s, there was a phenomenon known as natural philosophy, where in a very undifferentiated manner, people in the Western world speculated on all forms of the natural sciences, our place in the cosmos, as it were. But as time progressed from left to right here, the specialized sciences, as we would call them today, began to spin off, and natural philosophy began to shrink. And as these spun off, astronomy, chemistry, physics, geology, biology, in particular, you get to psychology, sociology, and latterly, archaeology. God had less and less of a place in these. These were naturalistic explanations. They were methodological, material naturalism. Just to prove that case in point, let's consider some words contrasted with a natural philosopher from the 1700s with some modern words. Here is the way a scientist used to talk. Not just any scientist, the father of taxonomic nomenclature. If you've ever heard Homo sapien, Tyrannosaurus rex, it's Carl Linnaeus, not a lightweight. And this is worth repeating in its entirety. Listen to this scientist. Man is to be understood as the final purpose of the creation, set upon the earth as the masterpiece of the works of omnipotence, contemplating the world by virtue of sapient reason, forming conclusions by means of his senses. It is in God's works that man recognizes the almighty creator, the all-knowing, boundless, and eternal God. And under God's rule, man is called to live righteously, stirred by the perfect justice of God's divine law. A scientist spoke like this. Scientists, when they were natural philosophers, sought to understand the nature of God's creation. They thought they could understand the Creator through the Creator's creation. Roll forward to the turn of the 20th century. This is an archetype, a distilled essence of where the specialized sciences have wound up. Man's origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. All the labors of the ages are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. All these things, if not quite possibly beyond dispute, are so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. You longtime readers might recognize the beginning of paper 102 paraphrases and plays off of Bertrand Russell's atheistic words here. This is one of the underlying presuppositions of the modern natural sciences. And it's a huge problem for us when we, 100 years later, after the Urantia book was begun to be bestowed upon us, as we try to true up what's in the book with what is in the modern sciences, the specialized sciences. And the philosopher and historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, noticed this problem. He used the word paradigm to describe this problem. You see, whenever a specialized science gets just advanced enough that it dares to create a textbook, a 400-page book that is put on the table of a freshman in college, and the freshman is told, you must memorize this, and you must recite this on the final exam to show that you understand this, and you can someday be a professional practitioner. Once you have a textbook, you have a paradigm. You have a set of presuppositions, initial assumptions that guide the future research. Now, that can be fine. You don't have to reinvent everything from scratch, but it can also be a problem. And amusingly, just because I come from geology as my specialized science that I was deeply in, this is a cartoon explaining a well-known problem. Today in geology, there is the plate tectonic theory, which, by the way, is the evolution of the continental drift theory mentioned in the Urantia book, way ahead of its time. But this geophysical model of the Earth predicts volcanoes and earthquakes in certain areas. But when we come upon an earthquake or volcano in a place we did not expect by this model, there are these ad hoc rationalizations that are devised. Undetectable, barely measurable, hypothesized plumes of hot material in the magma. That must explain that volcano in that place no one would expect it, like Yellowstone, a hot spot. This kind of thing happens in paradigms. It happened when Ptolemy's Earth-centric view of the universe reigned. They started adding epicycles to explain aberrations of planetary motions. You get locked into this. And it is the rare scientist indeed who can question the paradigm, who can question the presuppositions. After all, as was also mentioned yesterday, so often today science is a career, not just a calling. In archaeology in particular, there are countless presuppositions, things you take for granted, but I thought I'd mention just 4 here at the outset. Things we ought to think about as we read the Urantia book and true it up to today's archaeology. First, methodological naturalism is what reigns in archaeology. That is, materialism. You see an effect on the earth and you deduce that the cause must have been nothing but the collocation and interaction of material atoms at the electronic level of energy. God, or any of his delegated agencies, are irrelevant to the pursuit. This is a problem for the Urantia book because God is on every page of the book, on the line or in between the lines. Second, human civilization started less than 10,000 years ago, give or take a little. The Urantia book, not just here or there, but everywhere, says human history is vastly older than that. Dalmatia, 500,000 years ago, Andon Infanta, 1,000,000 years ago, the first teacher, religious teacher of truth, almost 1,000,000 years ago. Number three, a tough one these days. Um, Today, archaeology says genetics, human genetics, are immaterial to civilizational development. They say race is a social construct, and the only differences between societies are the result of social practice, and all humans essentially have an equal shot at advancing society or building advanced civilizations. The Urantia book paints a very different picture. There are advanced races that are bestowed upon us. There are advanced teachings that are brought to us. And yes, there are certain aggregations of people whose genetics allow them to express some of these higher ideas more effectively than others. No one who wants to keep their tenured professorship would talk about this today. And number four, Africa is humanity's original home, is a fairly unquestioned assumption today. It is an assumption that is proceeded from. All archaeological digs tend to say that's where the action is. But the Urantia book repeatedly says Central Asia is where a lot of the action is. And we're going to see that as we continue in this presentation. So back to digging into the Urantia book, I said, gosh, Göbekli Tepe. Maybe there's something in there that I can find about this intriguing site in Turkey. Um, I will get to that, I assure you. But man, I didn't get far into my research at all in the book before I was arrested by this. In paper 79, have you ever seen this before? Did you notice it? It says Adonia became the Central Asian commercial metropolis, being located near the present city of Ashgabat. What is a Greek sounding city doing in the middle of Central Asia well before 10,000 BC, given the surrounding context of these paragraphs? That is very odd. And then in paper 81, you have already found a bronze culture in Turkestan dating before 9,000 BC. Now, if you don't know much about archaeology, you might just blow right past that. But there is no archaeologist trained in the textbook archaeology, not today, not 100 years ago, who would let a statement like this fly. The freshman textbooks all say the Bronze Age began no older than 4,000 BC. You will not find bronze before 4,000 BC. Don't even bother looking for it. It's not to be found. So this is very at odds with science today and science even at the time the book was published. So I wanted to dig into these further. And courtesy of Matthew Block's work on SourceWorks, thank you, Mr. Block, I was able to look into what appears to be the parallel human source work for this area in paper 81. Mind you, this is not a new idea, right? The Bible is the most quoted human source work in the Urantia book, all over the place. In the case of this 9,000 BC bronze, it appears to be traced back to Henry Fairfield Osborn, a very popular scientist, his Man Rises to Parnassus book, published in the late 1920s. But Osborn wrote, copper is said to have been used at Anal Turkestan about 4,000 BC. Okay, well, 4,000 is not the same as 9,000. And copper is one of the components of bronze, but bronze is more advanced. Why did the Urantia book authors apparently deliberately change this number and change this fact as they brought it in and tried to weave the thread of the narrative of the fifth epochal revelation through this human source work? I had to look into this further. What an interesting thing to have changed. So I said, I wonder, does a now Turkestan exist? Or is it like Adonia, which appears to be a coined word? You can't Google that and find it. Well, a now does exist. So down, down, down the rabbit hole I went, but it felt important to look into Central Asia. On the screen, by the way, is a map I've constructed to very roughly suggest what life looked like here in the Levant, the Near East, and the Orient, the Far East, around 35,000 BC. So you can see right out of the Urantia book references to the Second Garden, the Nodites east of Eden. I won't walk you through everything on this diagram, but let's zoom in to this area east of the Caspian Sea, noting that the Adamsonite headquarters, those people who left the Second Garden following Adamson, is said to have been somewhere up here in this region. Well, this region, as it turns out, is here. And here are the Kopet Mountains, and here is Ashgabat. Two different spellings depending on how you transliterate it. And yes, this little village called Anau is just about 10 kilometers outside of Ashgabat. Okay, I said. We've got a original human source work that said something interesting is at Anau. It didn't say it in the Urantia book, but maybe I've dug and maybe, no pun intended, and maybe I've found something very interesting. What's at Anau? Well, today it's a largely standard village in what is today Turkmenistan. Um, and this is what you see there 100 years ago in this photo on the left and at the top, and that same thing at the bottom. 120 years ago, an American geologist was traveling through this region, and his eye noticed these hills sitting on the landscape. Raphael Pompelli was his name, and he said, I'm a geologist, and I know there's no obvious causal explanation for these hills sitting here on this flat alluvial plain. They are probably some artificial construction. And so he mounted an expedition the following summer. And yes, indeed, when they began to dig through it, they found signs of human habitation. These are tepes or kurgans. There are many names for them in many cultures, but they are the aggregation of material building up over time as the result of continual human habitation in one area. People's mud brick homes cave in on themselves, people throw out trash, they throw bones of animals everywhere, and the thing just builds up and up and up. It's mentioned in the Urantia book. So Pompelli undertook this excavation in 1904. It was a very short, aborted attempt. A locust swarm actually stopped the excavation. So goes life. But not before he was able to compile this lovely stratigraphic column going back through time. And notice in the bottommost layer here, so the oldest material, near the bottom of one of these kurgans, one of these two kurgans, first objects of copper and lead. Okay, so Raphael Pompelli found copper and lead. That's still not bronze, but what did he say about ages? Well, by the time he published his report in 1908, Pompelli concluded that these copper artifacts found in the lowest level of this kurgan would have been 8,000 to 9,000 BC. Just like the revelators said in paper 81. Okay. And this was something that a self-trained archaeologist, Pompelli, had no trouble writing. I did note in his memoirs about 10 years later, he said, I brought with me a professional archaeologist from the Middle East, from around the Mediterranean, and he constantly leaned on me and told me these things cannot be older. As we know, they can't be older than the third millennium. So there was already pressure to say things like this can't be older than 4000 BC, as we know. Pompelli published 9000 BC, but by the time he published his memoirs in 1918, he kind of recanted it, and he said, I guess the professionals are correct. Maybe it is only 4000 BC. So it seemed like Pompelli had found some pretty old stuff. And the next year in 1905, he had plans to return to do more excavation. Maybe to find some bronze, I thought, in that same layer. But the Russian Revolution happened in 1905, and he was not able to return. And the tiny little story I told myself when I came upon all of this was, okay, so someone began excavating it, but then a political upheaval aborted all the attempts, and so for 100 years, Anau has been sitting there waiting for You already have found a bronze culture in Turkestan dating before 9000 BC, and the revelators changed the numbers and the facts so that we would find this and be validated 100 years later. And wouldn't that be a great story if only my further research had found it to be true? It's not true. It's fanciful, but it's not true. I looked a little more, and even under Soviet rule, there have been many more excavations. This is the Kopet Dag Mountains in gray, and each one of these dots are excavations undertaken during the Soviet reign of the 20th century or later. And now is number 18. It's just one of the dots. And then I found in the late 1990s, a researcher from University of Pennsylvania returned to Anau, even under the repressive communist regime that is now ruling Turkmenistan. And he published this very impressive 500-page document summarizing and synthesizing all of the research at these little Anau kurgans. And he had this one uh, informative, but to my fanciful theory, devastating chart in his report. And I'm sorry, I have no cause to dispute it. These are radiocarbon dates, a fairly trustworthy material technique to date things back to about 10,000 BC. And he placed those lowest levels of the kurgans at Anau at no older than 4,500 BC. There are even other kurgans in the region at the base of the Kopet Mountains that are older than Anau. Anau is not even that interesting to us. I had this big pause and sense of deflation, like, well, what am I supposed to talk about now, other than the journey that I went on trying to understand what the epical revelation, what the Urantia book says relative to current understanding. It's not that simple. This bronze culture we've already found must sit on some shelf in some library somewhere, not recognized yet. But I took a step back and I said, maybe it doesn't matter, any one kurgan or hill anywhere. We'll get to Göbekli Tepe in a minute, I promise. If we were to rewrite and write a new textbook for archaeology, what would some better presuppositions be based upon the Urantia book, this epical revelation? First, God exists. It's on every page of the book. You cannot understand our place in the cosmos unless you take in the idea that God exists and his delegated agencies have a hand in the unfolding of creation through time, through the technique of evolution. Number two, human history is much older than we think. Much older than the standard 10,000 or maybe 12,000 BC human civilization is currently allowed for in textbook archaeology. And this is not just a typo or a once-off in the Urantia book. Japanese history begins at 12,000 BC in paper 79. Use of metals, plumbing, and stone building materials on the island of Crete in 12,000 BC in paper 80. Maritime trade between India and Mesopotamia in 7,000 BC over in paper 79. Dalmatia, 500,000 years ago. Genetics underlie social progress. You cannot, I think, skip over this. It's shot through the book in many places. The discussion of the colored races, the discussion of the Andinites that came before, the violet race that was bestowed upon us as an uplifted phenomenon. But today, obviously, archaeology has no knowledge of that and is resistant to ideas like this because of, yes, admittedly, the moral horrors of World War II and the counter reaction we are living with ever since. Number four, our world's history is particularly muddled. We don't know for sure, but it seems like on a more normal world, proceeding according to the normal order, not as deranged as ours is, as they call it, maybe archaeology is a little easier. Maybe one thing does follow from another, and maybe the supermaterial agencies, the planetary princes, the material sons and daughters, allow for a more discrete unfurling in one direction without so many backsteps. But here, bronze, stone, Iron Age, they can all coexist in the same place and at the same time within just a few miles of each other. Number five, civilization is a goal of God's design. Like the neo-Darwinist theory that guides modern godless evolutionary thinking, there's no particular goal in mind for humans in modern mainstream archaeology, other than perhaps the satisfaction of our material appetites, to feed and to procreate. But the Urantia book clearly says there is an upward pull, a Godward pull, to from more disorder to more order, from the less civilized to the more civilized. And that's just one of the presuppositions that would help us interpret the past better. Number 6, many strange things cloud matters. Many strange things is a phrase used just a few times in the Urantia book, and in this context, it's a reference to the strange, unorganized, and unattached influence on Urantia that were the non affiliated secondary midwayers, who for thousands of years could just do mischief. They don't tell us what, other than many strange things, but can secondary midwayers manipulate matter? Yeah, they can. Could a gigantic megalith that you would have to say it took hundreds of people to move to get to a site, could one of those megaliths have been moved by secondary midwayers? Yeah, it could. They're more advanced than us. Did it happen? That's a hard thing to investigate or to falsify, because ever since Pentecost, we don't have mischief-bent midwayers around anymore. So it's invoking a phenomenon that no longer exists in the present that would have been occurring in the past. So goes our strange planet. And finally, to quote Indiana Jones, they're digging in the wrong place. Today, archaeology is still basically in its infancy. It's pretty young science, and we tend to dig where it is easy to dig. We tend to dig where it might be politically correct to dig, or where political regimes allow us to dig and dig in a certain way. But, the kurgans at Anau literally stick up out of the ground begging to be excavated. Are they really where the action is at? Or is it somewhere else a little harder that's been buried further under the ground? Well, with these better presuppositions in mind, I said maybe I can finally get around to this Göbekli Tepe question. Göbekli Tepe is in the popular consciousness. I hope many of you listening to this already have an understanding of it. It's gotten a lot of popular press. Where is it? Well, going back to our map, it is to the west of where those Anau Kurgans were. Those Anau Kurgans were right about here, and we need to come over to this region. We're going to zoom in here, right in there. And Göbekli Tepe is here. Let's take a note of its proximity generally to the first garden. Okay, perhaps some influence there. Its proximity to Lake Van. All right. Yeah, the headwaters of the Euphrates, perhaps a migration path to the second garden. A lot of stuff going on in this area, admittedly. Okay, so maybe this is interesting. I started looking. So Göbekli Tepe was first discovered in the 1960s when farmers in Turkey kept having their plows hit these strange limestone blocks that were just apparently on the surface. But for 30 years, no one thought to do anything about it. Finally, in the 90s, they started saying, maybe we should dig. Is this limestone of any consequence? And on the left here and on the right, you can see what they found. And yeah, this is very compelling. Um, Carbon dating puts this older than 10,000 BC, thereabouts. And it seems like it was built up over a long period of time, perhaps. And on the limestone blocks are some well-executed artistic inscriptions that, students of the Urantia book might say, all right, that looks like totems put toward the animal that perhaps they were hunting or perhaps worshipped. All right. But very early on, looking at the popular press coverage of this, I came upon, I just couldn't not notice this, these quotes in National Geographic quoting the head investigator, the lead researcher of the Göbekli Tepe dig site today. And he says, in the Neolithic, which is this rough period of time, in the Neolithic, we have no real organized religion with clergy, with priests, that sort of thing. That all comes down much later. As we know, in 6000 BC, institutionalized religion had not yet evolved. And I asked myself, if the lead researcher, the tone-setting person for this entire excavation, disallows for institutionalized religion being older than 6,000 BC. And in the Urantia book, it says, we had people worshiping, congregating in the temple of the Father 500,000 years ago, and that there is something in our genetics that pulls us to worship and to revere. How trustworthy can the interpretations of Göbekli Tepe in the popular press be for us today? What might our better presuppositions have to say about this archaeological site? Well, let's just go through them. God exists. All right. I think this would make a difference at Göbekli Tepe. In a theistic framework, we can assume that the Creator has been continually trying to reveal himself to humanity. And with God's existence taken as a given, the monoliths and the carvings at Göbekli Tepe might not just be seen as a cultural artifact or some arbitrary phenomenon, but they're expressions of things that are built into our DNA and paralleled with phenomenon in the adjutant mind spirits and the Holy Spirit and the cosmic intuitions and even thought adjuster influence. This makes a difference. Number two, human history is much older than we think. Well, in fairness, Göbekli Tepe is already pushing back the curtain of accepted beginnings of civilization. Maybe it's 12,000 BC instead of 10,000 BC when people began to gather and do more complex things. But again, we have the garden, having people congregate and worship the Father in 35,000 BC. We have Dalmatia 500,000 years ago. So human history is much older than we think. We need a more expansive view of Göbekli Tepe in the context of things. Number three, genetics underlie social progress. Well, until about just 10 years ago at Göbekli Tepe, remember, it's only been excavated for 30 years. Until about 10 years ago, they said, well, no one was permanently inhabited here, but now they are finding signs of permanent human habitation as they dig deeper. If they've come upon human remains at some point at Göbekli Tepe, and personally, I think they probably will. They did it in now Turkmenistan that I talked about earlier. Um, in the framework of the fifth epical revelation, you could analyze the skeletal structures and perhaps even DNA, not sure, and try to understand what race of humans might have been here and what might they have been capable of and what influences might have they been under at this time. That matters. Number four, our world's history is particularly muddled. Well, yeah, that could help here. We could say this Göbekli Tepe could be an expression of some elevated influence from the first garden site, or lake, or the Vanites, or the migration path to the second garden. Maybe not everyone chose to make it there. Who knows? Lots of new theories could be entertained. Number five, civilization is a goal of God's design. This might not matter, if I'm honest, just at Göbekli Tepe, but there are many other tepes around Göbekli Tepe. And if there was a larger regional or even global phenomenon of constructing these perhaps reverential structures at a regional or global scale, that might just make more sense if we know there's always something in us that is called to be more civilized, and certain genetic abilities can allow people to differentially express that. Many strange things cloud matters. Well, I mean, some of the monoliths at Göbekli Tepe weigh 16,000 pounds. That's like 4 full-size trucks. That's heavy. And one thing I read suggested it would take 500 organized people to move something that big. Could have happened, but when's the last time you've ever seen 500 people doing anything in an organized manner together? Um, Good secondary midwayers have easily moved these monoliths, even ones who thought they were doing the right thing by helping people uplift their senses of worship by creating these impressive, awe-inspiring structures. Yeah, it's possible. It's hard to falsify. You're not going to find midwayer fingerprints on them or midwayer DNA, but it's something worth considering as an alternate hypothesis, to some extent, falsifiability notwithstanding. And finally, they're digging in the wrong place. What would Indiana Jones say about Göbekli Tepe if he also read the Urantia book? Well, it is a very compelling site, and I suspect people on the panel may want to talk about it some more. I'll do what I can. as a non-professional archaeologist to talk about it. But I will say this, and I'm not trying to throw any shade on Göbekli Tepe itself, but um, the government of Turkey has found this to be a very compelling tourist attraction, and they push for popular coverage of it very often in the press, and they get it. It's vivid, it's very visually arresting. They've built this lovely, elaborate tourist center and protective shield over it, far more um, drawing to the eye than you would need for a simple archaeological protective covering. It's possible that Göbekli Tepe is a little overhyped. I know some of you probably didn't come here to hear that today, but we, as students of the Urantia book, hopefully with a more objective view of history, we have to consider that. This may not be the most interesting place to have dug. It may just be one of the places a plow hit something and we said, huh, that's weird. But I hope that we don't limit our imaginations in the archaeological pursuit. Certainly, the Urantia book says you need to be digging deeper, you need to be digging older, you need to be digging in places that you might not think are so obvious today under your freshman textbook presuppositions. Whew. So I pretty much reached that by the end of the summer on this little journey that I wanted to tell you about. But I wanted to leave you with what I learned. I thought this could be useful to Urantia book readers who are trying to make sense of the specialized sciences when we dare dip our toes into them while holding the Urantia book also as something we take seriously. And I learned within myself, even after a lifetime of study of this book, I still have to be very careful. I don't know what I don't know. Um, Many of us, myself included, can read the Urantia book and think that we have a leg up on everyone else on Earth. We can have some spiritual arrogance and pride. It's tricky because there's some truth in that statement, not the pride and arrogance, but we do have the solution to profound religious and philosophic paradoxes laid out before us. And that is tremendously helpful. But I think we still need to respect the specialized sciences. I got this book by that University of Pennsylvania researcher thinking that it would be this undisciplined ideological pursuit. This is solid research. It's a lot of data tables, very dry, but it's well executed. No, God is not in that book, but there is still respectability in that, and I should be humble in the face of that. And number two, the world is a big place. This is really important for me, and I think for anyone who's been drawn to the book because of that mystery of the past, that plastic pipe sticking up out of the forest for no apparent reason. When you see something tantalizing in the popular press, there's a tendency to want to latch on to the most extraordinary interpretation immediately. I did it. Ah, and now Turkmenistan. It must be Adonia, the lost city of the Proto-Greeks. No, doesn't look like it is. The world's a very big place. And, the revelators said, yes, Adonia was near Ashgabat, Turkestan, but what's near for an archangel? 10 miles? 100 miles? If it's 100 miles, you've got a search area the size of South Carolina to look for. And it might be buried under hundreds of feet of debris washed down from the mountains in the intervening tens of thousands of years. And the remnants of Adonia may have degraded. Artifacts do that over tens of thousands of years. And then number three, impressive is a relative term. Göbekli Tepe is impressive, yes. But, gentle listener, I might draw your attention to cave paintings in France that are 3 times older than Göbekli Tepe that we've already known about for some time. This is in Chauvet Cave in France. There's a lovely movie, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that documents these. And man, I get chills thinking about this. Like, if if you know the technique of painting, like the artistry on display here is magnificent. Like someone knows anatomy and is holding realistic proportions. Someone understands gradations and shading of charcoal to represent light and shadow. Someone understands three-dimensionality to put this animal in front of that animal. And these this is not a flat surface. There are hummocks and swales in the limestone wall, and these animals were painted on to use those to actually give a three-dimensional effect if you use torchlight, as they would have back then while looking at them. This is a masterpiece by someone we don't know anymore, but it's very old. And this may just be Blue Man. This might not even be some Adamic or Andite influence. This might just be Blue Man. As they said, his artwork reached a maximum in Europe around 15,000 BC. So what were they doing in 30,000 BC? All of this to conclude, just remember where we started here. When I was walking my grandparents' land and I came upon these tantalizing, alluring things that moved me emotionally. Now, emotion is fine, but it is thoughts, not feelings, that lead us Godward. A pursuit of the truth needs to not be led by feelings, but by as objective of a pursuit as we can countenance among ourselves. So yes, Adonia became the Central Asian commercial metropolis. I mean, I can hear the musical score of Lord of the Rings, no joke, like swelling in the background as I hear this. And I can feel that as I walk on my grandparents' land, which is also behind me on the screen here today. Um, but the world's a big place. We don't know what we don't know. And impressive needs to be seen objectively as a descriptor. I'll leave you with a little bit of poetry. The revelators like to end sometimes on a poetic flourish. This is a poem from Raphael Pumpelly's 1908 publication, and it's by his son, who was with him on the expedition. And I like to think that Raphael Pumpelly II was sitting there looking at the sun setting with the dust motes in the air and the romantic vista, looking at that kurgan at a now, and he wrote this: "There are vistas dim where clouds dissever over far forgotten lands of lavish gleam, generations that are gone forever, kingdoms crumbling in a dim primeval dream, leaving only deserts gray and lonely, sites of unremembered cities gloomed and grand, tenanted by winds and shadows only, desolating winds and dunes of idle sand."
All right. Thank you, Brad. I had
Thank you.
also looked up Göbekli Tepe. The big connection I made was that, the thing about agriculture is that it's located in the area where there was first real sustained agriculture, and that maybe the temple is what got people to start thinking about agriculture, not agriculture and then came the temple. Jeff has his hand up, so Jeff, go ahead.
So essentially, Brad, you said archaeology searches for what happened and then tries to answer the question, well, I wonder why that happened, and assumes a common source, a single source, and a common capability. It assumes certain relationships or communities in both time, bronze can't happen at this time, it only happened at that time, intellectual capability, religious understanding or sense, tool development. Does it ever account for religious evolutionary differences? I mean, does it segment uh, locationally? Oh, these guys were into rock worship, and these guys were into tree worship, or does it go there at all? Another question, you mentioned DNA. Is there a DNA to that kind of religious paradigm relationship? Those that had kind of this kind of genetic bent, well, they tend to worship rocks, and these kind of tend to worship, trees. That kind of relationship. Um,
Mhm.
and you talked about midwayers being the stone movers. Is it possible the Adamsonites were, giants and capable of you made 100 small men, but only 10 big men to kind of anyway, fascinating study.
Yeah, I can try to comment to a limited sphere. I see other people here who have more extensive archaeology knowledge, but I agree with you that that idea, the diffusion of ideas, the single source. Someone invented bronze, and that's the only way it could have spread everywhere. As opposed to the idea that it may have independently emerged in multiple places because we're being pulled on and upward. Yes, those are the different types of presuppositions in archaeology today. Um, yeah, certainly as a cataloging of ritual beliefs, archaeology makes provision for, okay, well, these are stone worshipers, these are rock worshipers, and these are people worshipers. But as a differential examination of maybe how advanced they are, um, you know, maybe others here can comment on that, but it seems to me it's mostly just a purely cultural relativistic cataloging of the different rituals and not really judging which one might be more advanced or more primitive. Maybe you can see a thread of DNA, evolution through them, but I don't think they're saying, well, all of this is being led up by an adjutant mind spirit of worship. Well, of course, they're not saying that. And then, yeah, you bring up a good point about, Adamsonites, giants, other explanations for moving objects. I think that's an interesting point. I'd have to look back at the book to remind myself how quickly was it that the Adamsonites might have reverted to a more normal stature and size. We know Adam and Eve themselves were 8 feet tall, but each succeeding generation had a sort of falling off of this highest of genetics. But they also had the capability of having very uplifted ideas, mechanical and engineering ideas. So perhaps they were able to, it didn't take 500 people, maybe it only took 50 humans because they knew how to use levers and cantilevers. But still, the guy at the front giving it the heave ho was someone with a really high genetic origin, perhaps. Yeah, all good ideas.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, Mark's got his hand up.
Okay, I thought that was a very good summary of archaeological thought. You touched on salient points in archaeological theory, the philosophy of science, ontology, and even epistemology. So it was quite comprehensive in some ways. I know it's what it's like to be disappointed by research like you went through on one site. But nonetheless, you did a great job of relating it all to the Urantia book. But I think one of the most important points you make is how much our preconceived ideas affect our interpretations of scientific data. This is so true in all fields of science and really in all aspects of life. So many of us, will reject ideas or concepts or truths that we don't agree with, and just sort of cherry pick the ones that we do agree with, and then try to work them into our preconceived notions to prove that they're right. This is a real problem, even in politics. So anyway, one other point I want to mention is Thomas Kuhn, his book, which was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. His whole idea was talking about paradigm shifts. So, I mean, a paradigm was something, like you say, that we're sort of a set of ideas that we're stuck in and that do affect interpretations of science. But he was explaining how shifts to new understanding come about. And so the process of overcoming an old paradigm and replacing it with a new one. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just one point that, when you talk about paradigms, you should include that part too. One other thing was dating methods. When I was doing work in Jordan, we had I came out one day and the whole site was partially excavated and it was full of holes. And I thought, what the heck was going on here? And we discovered that it was mole rats. And so I did a study of all the stuff that the mole rats dug up to the surface or let drop to the bottom. And it was just amazing of the amount of material and the size of the material. Pottery shards as much as 3 inches in diameter. Huh. And this we found greatly affected radiocarbon dating, because radiocarbon dating is often done on very small samples. Mm-hmm. And when these newer samples drop to the bottom, then the older layers can be misinterpreted as being younger than what they actually are. Huh. So there's not enough critique in archaeology, as far as I'm concerned, on dating methods. And I think we need much more of it. Once again, people are just sort of, religiously accept radiocarbon figures without looking at the greater picture of how they're achieved, how they're obtained. So I think that I wouldn't give up on that one site in Turkestan just yet. I think it could possibly be 9,000.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm grateful that you were willing to be here. I know you're a professional retired archaeologist, and I didn't get to read it, but I did see that your paper on bioturbation exists out there, and so good on you for that. I know from geology, my specialized science, it's a problem in the geologic record too. Little shrimp bioturbating old beds of things, older than pottery shards. Um, I liked, I completely agree with you that Thomas Kuhn was like, well, here's not just the problem, but here's the solution. Here's how you dig out of a paradigm by looking for the evidence that was just dismissed or ignored. And I think those who were here yesterday would hear that, we've had 30, 40 years of the awareness of like Hox genes being these unexplained patterns in DNA, but it's taken decades for people to say maybe this isn't just random evolution on individual single mutations, but there's a macro phenomenon. But it took like decades. So eventually, the data that gets buried because it doesn't fit the paradigm eventually comes roaring back, and we do dig ourselves out. But it can, no pun intended, but it can take longer than any one of us in our lifetime would want. And then the final comment I would just make, you advertently or inadvertently used the phrase "we religiously accept," some tenet or doctrine or data, and that is certainly a problem in sciences today that don't have that natural philosophy underpinning, like Carl Linnaeus was quoted as having with God there. I mean, I came up through the geologic sciences, and people were far more apt to worship a mass spectrometer with awe and reverence than they were to go to church. And that's just scientism as it stands today, and something that the revelators warned us about throughout paper 195 of some of our problems today.
Yes, well, like Marcelo Glacier said, atheism is inconsistent with the scientific method. And the why he said that was because you've already got a preconceived notion in mind. Whereas, and even the book has a paragraph on this, that if a researcher or a scientist has a preconceived notion about the way it should be, well, of course, the results will be affected by that. So,
okay, thanks so much, Mark. Let's go to Halbert.
Thank you, Brad, for putting that together. Definitely one of my favorite topics. Regarding out of Africa, I wanted to say in my own research, more recently, just in the last year or two, I'm finding that to be increasingly disfavored, fortunately. It seems like the archaeological, or I should say especially anthropological, the fossil records, from around the world are really shooting huge holes in that anymore, that it's getting increasingly untenable. And I wondered whether you were seeing the same thing. Regarding genetics and evolution and the progress of genetics, the way you characterized it, it seemed a little bit inconsistent with Darwin's survival of the fittest, that we should expect intelligence to increase over time because it has survival value. So just on an evolutionary basis, I wondered whether you felt that was consistent enough. Regarding Göbekli Tepe in particular and its relationship to other sites, I certainly appreciated how you're pointing out that it's not completely unique and there's just so much to learn from the variety of sites in that area. Nonetheless, there's some specific things regarding the carvings at Göbekli that I think are especially noteworthy, and I wanted to bring that up and get whatever feedback you have. In particular, we've got on the megalithic pillars the parenthesis with an H inside. And I want to relate that to the huge H shaped carvings of stone at Puma Pinku in Bolivia that many people are familiar with. And it occurs to me, especially when taken in the Göbekli context, where you not only have that parenthesis with the ancient side, but you've got these snakes that are sometimes individualized and sometimes swimming in groups. It seems to me like these are memories and passing on in imagery depictions of teachings about genetics that were probably put forward by Adam and Eve, and that H is the double helix, and that these are not snakes but sperm, and so the individualized and swimming together feeds into the biology of it all, as how that functionally works. And I just wanted to lastly leave the comment that, like with Göbekli, initially they were saying there weren't dwellings and people weren't inhabiting that area, but then we have a little more time passing, more excavations. It shows up that is what occurred, and it just speaks to the general issue that we're always learning more, and these things are evolving, and who knows where it will lead. So thanks for indulging all those comments and for your work, and I leave it back to you to make whatever comments you like, and happy to engage any ideas you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Albert, and thank you for the material you compiled on your UB the News website. I looked at your report of Göbekli, and I look forward to other things you write there. I do agree there is a self-correcting mechanism in science. It's not uncommon to see reversals in the small, like, well, we thought it wasn't permanently habitated. Now we do, because we found one black swan, so to speak. So it's always gratifying when you see science that's willing to humble itself and say, well, we thought we knew, but we didn't. But the deeper the presupposition goes, sometimes the harder it is, which is, you mentioned double helixes in sperm being on a megalith. Like, that would be a deep presupposition that is in every freshman year. One thing you can know for sure is no one knew about DNA in 10,000 BC. Like, so that, you'd have to dig pretty deep into your framework to say, well, maybe they knew something.
One of the things about that issue that's so intriguing as it regards Göbekli Tepe in particular is that the deeper they dig down, the more the megaliths become larger and intricately carved and so forth. So they have this expression of advancing culture as they go further back in time, which is one of the great anomalies of Göbekli Tepe, and really, of course, feeds directly into what the Urantia Book has to offer about all of this. So, I think this is where there's a conversation that Göbekli Tepe in particular invites, that scholarship is having such a hard time dealing with, that it gets ignored. But it's not that they don't acknowledge the facts, they just don't know what to deal with them, right?
And that's right in line with Thomas Kuhn. He says, this is what happens in a paradigm. The data with no obvious explanation gets an ad hoc rationalization, and it kind of sits there for a while till it builds up enough to a critical juncture. And then I will say to that point, to one of the things you raised, you said, well, wouldn't survival of the fittest allow for more intelligence to be selected? My interpretation of the Urantia book is, yes, there is a place for that, but there's also that reference to when there's an uplifted phenomenon, from up above, and then that uplift ceases because of rebellion or default. It says things fall back down to their natural evolutionary level, So and that would be an example of something you might see at Göbekli Tepe, something falling down to some more natural evolutionary level. It can't hold at that higher elevated place because the uplifted energy is no longer on our Earth. I could comment on out of Africa, but I'm way out of my wheelhouse on that. I agree with you that theory is under duress now.
Okay, let's thank you, Halbert. Let's turn to Chuck.
So Brad, great work. Always appreciate all your contributions. That list, especially that you offered, a list of considerations about understanding history, beginning with God exists. I mean, that's the great place to start.
Yeah.
if we're really going to try to understand things. And along the way in that list, you made a point about civilization being a divine goal. I don't know if you put it quite that way, but the idea is that we progress, right? But what we learned from the Urantia book, that civilization is also a divine gift. That civilization didn't just originate out of human invention; it was taught. I mean, we learned that about Dalmatia. So even though Dalmatia suffered the consequences of rebellion and didn't endure in the way it was intended to be a model of civilization that would still exist even now, right? Mm-hmm. That was the point of that, with all the different councils and the parts of civilization that are necessary to make a whole. And this whole thing about prejudice against looking for God in history or archaeology or our past or just understanding in general is not new. When I was researching our podcast about Dalmatia, I discovered someone named Berosus. Anyway, he was a Greek historian who was writing in the 3rd century BC, I believe, and claimed to have access to many books which had been preserved at Babylon. And he took the point of view that at the time he was writing, there was a dispute, there was a disagreement. Is civilization the product of human effort over time, or is human civilization the result of revelation? So he was of the mind that civilization was a result of revelation. And he, from whatever resources he had access to, he had knowledge of Dalmatia, apparently. At least he wrote in a way that showed that he had an understanding of that.
Yeah.
Like, for example, he references an ancient Sumerian legend that supposedly goes back to 400 and some thousand years ago, where it says he's speaking to some supernatural being that showed up on the scene at the time. He gave to men the knowledge of letters and sciences and every kind of art. He taught them to construct houses, to found temples, to found cities, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He revealed to them the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. He gave men everything which is connected with the civilized life.
Wow.
And that's what the Urantia book says about Dalmatia.
No kidding.
So the fact that record exists, I think, is obviously very significant, but it's been kind of shoved aside, just like the time he was writing, maybe, or since then, that the world has gone to the competing view, which is civilization is, exclusively a product of gradual human effort over time.
Right.
So he had this other idea that maybe God was involved, that there was a revelatory process involved in teaching the arts of civilization. So this idea that civilization not only is a divine goal, but it's also a divine gift, is what we learned from the Urantia book. But that understanding has kind of been erased by rebellion because of the fate of Dalmatia, the garden, and subsequent events.
Yeah. To play off something that was mentioned yesterday by Gard Jameson in his presentation, it is a distinctly Western Enlightenment phenomenon that as natural philosophy got carved up and sliced into natural sciences, more and more humans began to say, maybe we've built this thing ourselves. Maybe we're not uncovering the fingerprints of the creator in nature, but we're building it ourselves, like a new Tower of Babel. So we're more distant than ever today, given 300 plus years of Enlightenment thinking, to thinking, well, we don't need God. We don't need uplift. We're building the tower ourselves to our own sense of pride. Those lines of thoughts will not hold. They are not cosmic, and they are, as they say in paper 195, currently disintegrating even today.
Yeah. Well, that's encouraging. I mean, one thing that's been noticed is that in terms of like artifacts, it's like the older stuff is more advanced, typically, like in Machu Picchu. the older parts of that, megalithic construction are the more amazing parts. And then they build upon it, on top of it, with smaller stones and smaller bricks, right?
Indeed. But you've got to be a bold graduate student to challenge the prevailing dogma of your graduate advisor to say something like that today.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
again, yesterday, someone mentioned someone is trying to challenge the Big Bang, but even then at the end of their paper, they're like, by the way, I'm not really challenging it. Please
Yeah,
give me
right.
funding.
You have to
Like, it's
apologize first.
just life,
Yeah, yeah. But one other thing I wanted to comment on that you had on your list there is the idea of digging the wrong place. And the Urantia book is a wonderful source of clues to maybe find some of the right places.
Yeah.
So the Adamsonite civilization is something I'm particularly interested in, and
Yeah.
it rivaled Mesopotamia in its day. That was started by Adamson and Rada, who were very high. It was pure line Adamite, and Rada was pure line Nodite. So not only did they, spawn the secondary midwares, but they created a whole civilization, which it's in an area where there hasn't been any digging yet. So that map you showed of all the archaeological sites along the northern, where the highlands of the Kopet Dag meet the flat plain, that's where all the, what do you call them, Kagans? Kagans? Is that what you call them?
Kurgans, yeah.
Yeah, Kurgans. Yeah, those hills. That's where they're all found.
Right.
That was probably a fertile region back in the day, and there were indeed probably a lot of cities along where the rivers flowing down from the Kopet Dag met the plains down below.
Indeed.
But that's not as old as 35,000 years ago,
right?
When the Adamsonite Center was, up and running.
They may have been somewhere else, up in another little fertile valley, more up in the foothills.
So they have to start looking up in those fertile valleys,
right?
And which one would it be? I mean, there's like a whole series of them.
Indeed,
but there's one that has a river that runs west into the Caspian at a location that's almost directly across from Lake Van would be. So it makes sense that they would take a boat across. There was probably communication back and forth between those two centers, and also with the Second Garden. So it makes sense that they pick a valley that maybe had easy access to a river that could take them to the Caspian Sea and then cross west. So
indeed,
the Lake Van area, which is still a happening thing, and then down into the other areas. So the Urantia book someday, hopefully, will be appreciated for some of the clues it offers.
It opens a lot of that up, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck.
But man, the idea that things are way much older, the origins go much, much, much farther back, kind of just opens up a whole expansive understanding of this planet.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Mark, I'll get to you in just a minute. Let's go to our audience and look at a few of those questions, and then we'll get back to you. But you may be able to inform this first question that I'm going to ask, and it's from our previous actual participant in the symposium, which is David Newfer, because I know that David's been interested in this he has a real problem about carbon dating, and he's wondering that if we took something that we knew, we know from like the Urantia book, and we think that they found something close to it, would we be able to improve our carbon dating to where things that they say in Revelation actually begins to match up, just like we were talking about yesterday, things are beginning to match up in certain areas of science that didn't match up 100 years ago, but they're matching up now.
I can comment from the geologist perspective. There is, of course, something called there's a calibration curve. So there is a correction that's applied to carbon dates. To be fair, it's relatively minor, at least in the current thinking. It's not doubling or quadrupling the date. There are already like anchor points, like the Dead Sea Scrolls through multiple lines of evidence kind of self-date themselves to a certain time, and they've sampled that and said, all right, well that carbon-14 seems to match up with that. But as has been pointed out here, I think in the chat, did they sample the correct thing on the Shroud of Turin, or did they sample a patch? These are important things to look at. Did they sample bioturbated beds? Important to look at. The last thought I have is carbon-14 seems to be a fairly refined technique at this point. It loses its efficacy beyond, I forgot the exact, there's a falling off of the carbon-14 isotope. You can't go much beyond, I think 10,000 BC, maybe 20,000. You just get down into the noise of the background. So it'll always have some pretty strict limits. It'll never be able to carbon date Dalmatia. Too old, too old.
Okay, that helps. Okay, we've got another question here from someone you know well. Brad, Ruthie asks, given that every science is limited by the framework within which it chooses to operate, and also given that both the education and employment of scientists rely on adhering to imperfect pre-existing frameworks, what words of wisdom could we share with students and working scientists?
How would I say to be wise about this? I mean, try to offer wisdom. If you're a practicing scientist in one of these fields, offer wisdom in a wise way. Offer wisdom in a place that you think there are ears to hear, where there's a question being asked. If no one is asking the question of, could these letter H's on this monolith be anything other than an arbitrary, culturally relativistic symbol? You're not going to get very far with saying, hey, I've got an idea. But if you're in that group of people and there's some opportunity to offer some other bit of philosophy, some bit of suggestion for reflective thinking, if there's an opportunity to point people to very crisp lines of thought like Rene Descartes, lines of exacting precision using cosmic intuition, and you can uplift your coworkers in a more subtle way, you may help lead them to truth. But it's very easy to over-reveal to people, and of course to be just instantly ostracized if you start invoking what they would think is just fringe Anunnaki conspiracy theories in our break room. What are you doing, man? But beyond that, just no matter what our material pursuits are, no matter how many yardsticks you measure our material adventures, to quote paper 195, always hold fast to the eternal truth. Things will advance here in time. So all this will get corrected. This is Michael's planet. This place will get to light and life. It is not your job to get it to light and life in your lifetime. Trust me, it's not your job. What is your job in this lifetime? Your one talent of time, to quote part 1 somewhere in there, is to see to your salvation, to be right with God in your heart. And if you get that right, now I'm quoting the master, that which flows from your cup will naturally bear the fruits. You will be spiritually fragrant. People will wonder, what is he or she? What are they doing that makes them so uncannily interesting to me? They're not like the other scientists or coworkers around here. And you may draw in a truth seeker. You may not draw a number of other people, but you will draw the people who want to know the truth because they are in bondage to something that is untrue and they want to be set free.
We have excellent examples of scientists who are devout religionists, and we need to study them. Living right now is Francis Collins.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. One of the best, I personally know him, one of the best scientists I've ever known in my life. Okay. Also one of the most sterling individuals I've ever known in my life. He is, a devout Christian and came from a totally irreligious background. He came to it himself. All right. And so he's living now. Look at people like Charles Townes, who won a Nobel Prize and a Templeton Prize. University of California, phenomenal physicist. He taught Sunday school every weekend of his adult life. Look at Faraday. He had an 8th grade education. Look at Faraday's law, all the things that he did. He preached every Sunday in the worst part of London and then took the train back to Cambridge. All right. Look at John Polkinghorne, who we just lost in the last few years. Phenomenal particle physicist. These people are doing this today as, and they're consummate scientists. And so I try to point this out that, they think that the scientist community is this godless group of, folks.
Mm.
They are not. Okay. And there's a whole institute at Cambridge called the Faraday Institute, which is where science and religion meet. And I had been to that institute and had participated in one of their classes. There is a lot of places where science and religion meet, and we just need to look at it more and not, we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're throwing the scientist out because we're casting all things as like some sort of godless entity out there, and
Right.
and it's not.
I completely agree with you. Of all things, to quote Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, quoting
Mhm.
his mom, she says, when disaster strikes, godlessness in a pursuit, look for the helpers, look for the people who are running into it and still trying to make a difference. So I hear the spirit of what you're saying. I do want to point out, it's old data, but in 1998, there was a survey of the members of the National Academy of Sciences. So the standard bearers, the top chefs, 93% of them do not believe in a personal God. So
But in
it's
that same thing,
mhm,
look at the younger cohort in that
right,
group. Okay,
right,
that's the old God. Now remember, most of those are now off the page. Okay,
right.
most of those folks have moved on to the mansion world. But the younger people that they polled back then, Pew did another one in the 1990s, but they looked at the younger cohort of scientists and they found out that over 50% of them believed in a personal God.
Good, good.
Okay.
Well, we're
So,
seeing the horrors of materialism and we're reacting to it.
right,
Good,
and we're
good.
reacting to it. So, sorry to get into the weeds of science, but this is sort of my area. But
Yeah.
anyway, go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry I took up your time.
Oh, I just wanted to comment on this whole business of the survival of the fittest. That whole notion is kind of a misnomer, really, because even in Urantia book, they tell us that the most inferior primates survived and went on to create other forms of simians. So one scientist once described it as survival of the mediocre, and I think that's probably more to the point. Yeah, digging in the wrong place. Well, the book mentions the Sawalik Hills, very interesting in northeast India,
Yeah.
or what is now Pakistan, actually, for the earliest transition types. It's not the missing link, they say, but it is the earliest types. But of course, that whole area is just hundreds of feet of scree from in the foothills of the Himalayas. And it's a very large area. And throughout it all are very, well, angry tribes living in the area as well. So it's quite a dangerous place to do archaeological work. But in the future, some brave soul will discover that, and that would be quite interesting. Well, I also want to like when that site that with the Bronze Age and the 9,000, I can't remember the name of it, sorry. That at the time of the initial excavations, most archaeologists weren't any better than pot hunters. They really didn't do a very good scientific job of recording in situ artifacts and what have you.
Right.
Now, and when the Russians took over, well, the first excavations were absolutely awful. Like they really didn't know what they were doing at all. And I'm sorry if any Russians are out there, but it wasn't very good. Maybe now it's improved considerably. So those are two things, two factors I think that you have to look into as well. Oh, and the bit about how do you get people to listen? And I think one of the most important things that Jesus said to us was we have to be tactful, in how we deliver the message. You can't just go blurting it out, God saves all and Jesus saves on your soapbox. It's just not going to work. And he is a very good listener, so he found out what people were interested in, and he built on that.
Yeah.
So tact and listening and and just doing things wisely rather than going out there with a bulldozer and trying to change everybody to your point of view.
Amen. And that was even one of the final admonitions Jesus gave to James Zebedee. He's like, you lack tact. That might get you killed. And it probably did.
Yeah. Halbert, if you want to make a quick comment, we're going to have to pull this to a close, okay?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to say at the end of this, that we all need to constantly be on guard for the types of biases that creep into all these different areas of science. And, sometimes we have things progressing and sometimes we have things regressing for all kinds of political reasons, for economic reasons, et cetera. Just like people had trouble letting go of Clovis first and still do, that's sort of the poster child, for the issue. We've got all kinds of problems like that, and cultures and communities that don't really want to uncover the truth for one ethnic reason or another, political or economic or religious. So I just wanted to, remind us all of that challenge. It's a perennial challenge on this planet.
Okay, thank you, Halbert. Brad, we're going to call this to a close unless you have a final comment you want to make. Is everything good?
Thank you all. And thank you for letting this dilettante archaeologist who had no business presenting something like this bring this to you for consideration. Thank you for those of you with specialized knowledge. This was very helpful, and I hope to the glory of God, too.
Absolutely.